So now, we're really pleased to welcome Wolfgang CRAMER. Thank you for coming from Aix-Marseille to give this presentation in person. You are CNRS Research Director at the Mediterranean Institute of Marine and Terrestrial Biodiversity and Ecology, INBE, at Aix-Marseille University. Your research team was initially interested in the area of modeling forest dynamics under climate change, and then seeks a broader understanding of consequences of climate change on terrestrial ecosystem. Since 1992, you were a contributor to the IPCC at various levels of responsibilities, and you were associated with the Nobel Peace Prize 2007, awarded to Al Gore and to the IPCC. Also to the Gulbenkian Prize for Humanity 2022, and co-author of the Working Group 2 Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability of the IPCC 6th Assessment Report Cycle. You were co-president of the French National Committee for Global Change until September 2021, and you were elected member of the French Academy of Agriculture in 2017. So I would like to invite you to come on stage for a conference on Can we reverse the decline of Earth's habitability?
Thank you very much. Of course, the first problem is always to correctly pronounce habitability, which is really quite a tongue breaker, as we say in German. But thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for also being here in so large numbers. I am going to touch upon a few issues that Valérie also touched upon this morning, but with my own flavor, I hope, and with my own perspective. And so the question, as I put it, if we can reverse the decline of Earth's habitability, is one that I have only started asking very recently, because we are in a situation, a couple of colleagues and I, where we are trying to find a little bit new terminology that works perhaps better than the terminology we had so far about sustainable development. Because sustainable development is a term in itself problematic, and I don't want to dwell very much on that, but I will come back to habitability later as I think a good summary descriptor of what it is that we actually want from this planet. I mean, you could say we can have a planet that has a widely changing climate and widely changing biodiversity. That's all. I mean, other planets may have that, but we actually want to have a planet that's habitable for us, so that we can actually live a decent life on it. I want to make 4 points. One is where we are with respect to habitability today. What are the projections for the future? All very, very, very much as a summary. What are the kinds of responses that are given at the moment, and also maybe which ones should be given. And then I end with a point that actually Valérie started with and came back to several times later, the transformation. So the status today, of course, as you know, there are 1,000 different ways to show the recent evolution of climate change, despite all the efforts. And I'm not showing the frequently shown caricature of the CO2 evolution and all the conferences of the parties of the Climate Convention, but it's clear that despite all our efforts, climate is still changing. Temperatures are rising, and there are growing perturbations in many parts of the world. And we also know why that is. We know that it's not just a matter of CO2. There are several greenhouse gases, and this is an old diagram by now, but it's very well accepted and confirmed regularly by the Global Carbon Project and others. It's not just the burning of fossil fuels, it's also our destruction of the biosphere, which is the point that I am particularly interested in, because I'm an ecologist by training, and I think that taking care of the biosphere is something we should do anyway, even in the absence of climate change. One thing that struck me when we put together the last IPCC Working Group 2 report was that we are now at a point where the scientific evidence is stronger than ever, of course, about climate change and its impacts. This is not only the case because we have more research than before, but it's also the case because climate change has actually been going on for a couple of decades now, and therefore it is, in simple terms, easier to go somewhere and measure it and measure the impacts of it. And this is a study that I would not be able to repeat myself methodologically, but I completely trust its results. It's a machine learning analysis of the scientific literature on impacts of climate change and their geographic location of the planet, and they found 77,785 scientific papers, each of which showed and demonstrated an impact of climate change, observed impact of recent climate change somewhere on the planet. And one thing that this is demonstrating, not only that there's this enormous volume of evidence, but there's also basically no spot on the planet where we do not actually now observe these changes. And that is something that I think should be seen more often, because we still have a discourse somewhere where they say, well, it's someplace else, or it's not so bad, or last week was very cold, or all these ridiculous pseudo climate skeptic arguments that we still hear everywhere in the public discourse. But this is, as you know, not the only problem we have with environmental degradation of the planet. We have also a rapid loss of species, which is likewise, just like with climate change, it is well observed. Even though we do not know every single species and its life cycle on the planet, still there's many things that are unknown in biology, but we have enough data, enough observations to be able to estimate the percentage of species from different life forms in different environments that have been lost or that are threatened by extinction in the near future. And we can even do this now with relatively high level of detail for different groups of species. So this, like the previous diagram on climate change, this got nothing to do with scenarios or projections or models. These are sheer observations. And that is something that has really changed in my lifetime. When I started being interested in this, everything was based on models, on projections for the future. And people said, oh, who believes in models anyway? And it feels a little bit frustrating now, 30 years later, to be here and say, okay, you didn't believe our models, do you now believe our observations? Because you said at the time that it's only observations that matter. Now the observations are here, unfortunately, and they are very bad. One thing that the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, has shown very clearly in its last global assessment is, of course, that much of the species loss is not due to climate change, and it's very important to bear that in mind. It is due to the changes that we impose on the land and also on the ocean, overfishing, for example, or artificialization, if we use the French word of the land. It's also direct exploitation of biological resources. It is climate change, of course. It is pollution. It is the arrival of invasive alien species because of our changes in commercial exchange around the world, and of other factors. And again, for different for different systems, we can actually show, no, I'm not going to hold this well enough still, the relative importance for those different forces that are affecting both ecosystem loss and the loss of the species, either regionally or at the planetary scale. And IPBES has also done a great job in analyzing not only these direct drivers of change and the loss of biodiversity, but also the indirect drivers behind them, which can be demographic, it can be economic and technological, can be due to institutions, or of course also, as we very well know and every day see in the media now, by conflicts and war and at other times due to epidemics. This is the positive side of this is, of course, that many of these things we know something to do about, what we can do about. But we also know that if we don't go towards more drastic action in order to avoid the loss of these ecosystems, we will see trends, just like we see the trends in climate that are not going in the right direction at the moment. One thing that is more coming, I think, to everybody's mind and also comes out more strongly in the scientific literature now is the role of extreme events, various kinds of extreme events. Valerie has already mentioned the World Weather Attribution Project this morning, which I find a very fascinating rapid response activity by the scientific community. Because obviously when you have a large wildfire, there's not immediately an easy attribution case. You cannot immediately say, okay, we see a wildfire, this is because temperature has passed this or that threshold. A wildfire is a combination of a number of different things. It can be helped by warming because the forest, if there was any, has been drier than before, and when you have high temperatures, it may be more easy to set fire on it, but it is also a consequence of land use change, particularly in the Mediterranean region, when you have an abandonment of agropastoralism, then you will have more wood in the landscape, and that wood then, if it is dry and very hot, it will more easily take fire or produce larger fires. This is only to say that we are beginning to, unfortunately, have sufficient observations of these extreme events to better understand them. We would rather prefer to not have them. And the similar cases, of course, for floods and storms such as this one in Libya last year, which was an event where we probably will never know how many people actually lost their lives, but there were thousands of it, and which was also an event which unfortunately we forgot about, I think about 2 or 3 weeks later, partly because of other terrible news in the world, but even without those news, I think these losses of life and property would have been forgotten very rapidly because they happen to occur in a country that is not very much in the media. So extreme events are consequences of environmental degradation that we see more and more and that we understand better and better. And this one, we can also say, is a strong case for an extreme event which has cost a lot of lives because adaptation to the known risk was insufficient, because Libya is not a country that is currently in a position to manage, for example, the dam that was higher up and that broke during this storm in a way properly as a rich or better organized country would have been able to do. So there's a connection between the dramatic impacts that climate change and biodiversity loss have on people and the social status of people, well, the social status of countries and the social status of people in each country. And this is something that increasingly interests me. IPCC, in its 6th assessment report in Working Group 2, has tried to illustrate some important aspect of this vulnerability of people in this map, which had caused a lot of debate in the final plenary and unfortunately couldn't be retained in the summary for policymakers, but it's one of these elements that are still in the report and that I invite you to look at. The map aims to show basically where habitability on this planet is at risk. Essentially, where is it that people live now, today, under some conditions, and they may not be able to do so in the same way if we let climate change evolve in the way it is currently doing. And one needs to read around this map because it's very difficult on a global map to show what I was just indicating. It's clear that in the tropics, and particularly in Africa, there's a large number of people who are directly under risk of losing habitability, of losing the essential conditions that they would need for their livelihoods. But there are also people in Europe and in North America and in other continents, and they are usually those people who live in rich countries but have themselves very low income, or are otherwise or are sick, or are otherwise not as well protected as probably most of you in this room are, and as I am personally. And that's why the map points out with these blue dots there, the examples of indigenous groups that exist almost everywhere in the world. They do not represent a lot of people, but they represent people. They represent human beings, and they are very well documented in this chapter. And they are usually the ones that are more at risk than you and I are. So this leads us to one, I just want to point out one result from IPCC Working Group 2 that has a bearing on this concept of habitability, and it's in chapter 8 and in the summary for policymakers, and it's basically this sentence that approximately 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in contexts that are highly vulnerable to climate change. So how can this be translated other than by saying, well, for almost half of the people on this planet, we are actually not sure if we can guarantee habitable conditions anymore. And I think that's something that we should, we can talk about temperatures, we can talk about many other indicators, but for me, it took me some time to think about this, and of course this doesn't mean that people are killed tomorrow by some extreme event. It's a multitude of various physical and social conditions that are impacted by climate change and that will make it harder or impossible for people to live in the places where they live. And I also want to add immediately, a lot of people, when they saw this number, they said, oh, so we will have that many climate refugees. No, we will not. And there's a lot of interesting work, and I think you had that exposed last year at this conference on climate refugees. There isn't such a thing as a climate refugee. Very few people move across the planet with a kind of barcode on their front saying, I'm a climate refugee. There's always a complex of reasons that make it necessary for people to move, and for most people who actually most of these 3.3 to 3.6 billion people that we are referring to there, they will never be climate refugees because they will not have the options to do so. So it's not an issue of migration or refugees, it's an issue of direct human suffering on the planet. And of course, if we want to look, if we want to ask for the help from IPBES or IPCC in understanding how this might evolve in the future, we have, again, maybe not 77,000 studies analyzed in the same way, but we have substantial number of references. This is a more rarely cited study that I found interesting for the Eastern Mediterranean, which is basically showing that the range of temperature conditions in Eastern Mediterranean cities experienced under a high emission scenario by the end of the 21st century will be just not even resemble conditions today. The coolest summer months will be still warmer than the hottest summer months a few years ago. So we live basically in a situation where the range of conditions that people this is a combination of urban heat island and global warming, by the way, where the combinations under which most people live, and particularly, and Valerie has already made that reference, those who cannot afford air conditioning and who live under the impact of the rich people's air conditioning in their houses, they will basically lose habitability. Just a word about Antarctic deglaciation, which is, of course, a process that we are beginning to, we still have uncertainties about. It's one of these low likelihood, high impact scenarios that have gained recent interest by the IPCC and that are also a direct threat for millions and millions of people living in coastal settings such as in the Nile Delta. No question about that. Also there, usually the poor people are the ones that are more at risk than the rich people. What I find interesting about this, and this is a personal reflection, is that the first time I heard about this process was when I was an undergraduate student, when Hermann Flohn from Bonn University came to our university and gave a talk about this paper from 1978, essentially presenting that risk. And everybody else in the room said, well, yeah, scenarios, and we don't know even the future if global anthropogenic climate change is reality. So this is news in a way because we are learning so much more about these Antarctic processes, but they are, at the same time, it's a really old hat. I don't need to to spend time on this because Valérie already did this morning. What I find impressive with the toolboxes that we have is that we can actually show not only that every increment of global warming has an increment in damages, but we can also show where they are and what their likely nature is. So we are close to getting to the point where we can actually map not only, as it was shown in the global map before, where habitability might decrease on the planet, but also who will be the most affected people and because of which factor. And inversely, we can show that if there is a more serious effort in mitigating climate change than those that has been shown by the 28 COPs that we have experienced so far, then we will be able to avoid a significant part of those changes. So I don't need to go through this. I only want to demonstrate that IPCC Working Group 2 has done this work both for natural and ecological systems, but also for human systems. And again, this is a map that Valérie has already shown. So the one thing that is, of course, gaining additional attention is that these basically monotonous and more or less linear projections that are behind the previous set of slides, they may lose their realism in the light of some risks for passing tipping points. And there are some recent studies where the likelihood by which we might pass certain tipping points is attributed to certain degrees of warming. And there are also new papers that are showing that tipping points among them, each other may be connected, that the passing of some tipping point somewhere could trigger another one someplace else. I find all this very worrying. It will be much harder to measure exactly how the passing of any such tipping point will affect habitability on the Earth. And it's something that I've been wondering a lot about, particularly the Atlantic meridional ocean circulation in recent years. There's a lot of interesting recent work, including some that came out last week, about the fact that this is a real risk for the near future, or maybe it's already ongoing, but our capacity of actually mapping who will be affected by that and how much is limited, also because of the physical complexities of this. What I'm understanding from Stefan Rahmstorff about the amok circulation breakdown risk is that, for example, the distribution of tropical rainfall zones might change rapidly as a consequence of that. It's not something that you usually think about when you think about the North Atlantic, but it's not just a question of Ireland and Scotland becoming a little bit cooler. There could be global consequences of passing of those tipping points. So that's the situation that we have. Already a lot of damage has occurred, and we have very great worries from our projections. Now, what about the responses? What would you expect if you had a rational society with actors and of all kinds of policymakers, of civil society by and large, journalists, media, what have you, industry leaders? You would think that they would go into a rational discussion on how to avoid these risks and how to make sure that habitability is not actually limited. And we know we have some basis for this discussion. For example, one text that I think is often looked at too briefly is the text that was signed in 1992 at the moment of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. What's actually the objective of that convention? Well, it's of course to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate. People might say, what does that mean? Does it mean 1.5 or does it mean 2 degrees or something like that? And as you know, there wasn't anything like that in the convention at the time. But the convention was very clear about some other points. It was saying 3 things. that we do not have dangerous climate change if we have a situation where ecosystems can adapt naturally to any climate change that might be there. That's a good indicator. It's an indicator that a biologist can do a lot with, and that also, as my examples have shown, is already some demonstrating that currently we do have dangerous interference. Also, it's actually a goal that food production should not be threatened. And of course, with all technology advances and so on, but we should make sure, whatever we do, that we don't go into a system where we have risks of limited food supply, and also that, of course, economic development, whatever one had in mind exactly in 1992 with that term, should be able to proceed in a sustainable manner. So, a lot of suggestions are being made to find responses that could actually help us achieve the avoidance of this dangerous climate change. I'm only showing one here completely out of the ordinary to say that I have nothing against technological solutions. This is also something that, in a different form, a slide that Valérie also showed before, and that comes out of work that Gonnery Le Cosanet and Valérie and others have made right after the last IPCC report. IPCC gives us clear indication that transforming our transport systems to transport, for example, based on bicycles, would actually represent a technological solution to avoid dangerous climate change. Who would have thought about that? There's still in every city where you have a proposal to get rid of the cars and develop bicycle transport. There's resistance for all sorts of reasons, but the same people will always say, "Oh, we need some technological solution for avoiding climate change and its worst consequences." It may sound like a side issue, but it's of course one of the many issues many options that we have to technically improve our living, our livelihoods in such a way that the risks of climate change are lower than we would expect, or that we can currently project. So habitability. What is habitability? We define it as a physical and social conditions required for decent human and also non-human life on Earth. I would like to briefly insist on this non-human because there's a strong ethical perspective to it. For a long time we have argued, okay, biodiversity and ecosystems are important for us because they deliver services, pollination is important for our food and so on. It's all very nice. Yes, and I agree, and it's all tons of reasons there to argue for the conservation of biodiversity. But ultimately, who are we as one species to decide that there are so and so many other species that no longer need to live on this planet because we do not know what their essential function is for us? So from a fundamental ethical point of view, and I'm going to make a few more ethics-related remarks after this, we actually have a moral responsibility to preserve also the conditions for non-human life on Earth. A very simple, and I don't want to put that as a too negative term, way to express how human habitability could be at risk on the planet is this study, and there are a few of them now, where basically using the old ecological niche concept, which basically says that if it's too cold, you can't really be well, if it's too hot, you can't really be well, but between the two, there's a range where we can basically live. That's what's called by these papers the human climate niche, and it's one way to find that there are actually very likely regions on Earth where, with increasing warming, it might actually become impossible to live, other than with some very strong technical constructions, houses with extreme air conditioning or that sort of thing, like you would have on Mars or on the Moon. So for me, it's a side aspect of habitability research. What we really need is, this is just a beautiful diagram, but I believe in the message it's passing, is that not only should the biosphere be allowed to function in some normal physiological and ecological way. But in order for society to exist in exchange with this biosphere, we need to have a real view on what social conditions mean. And if we allow ourselves to have a society in which inequality is continuing to increase, we are going to be less likely to survive or to remain in habitable conditions for society as a whole. The IPCC has expressed that by this diagram, by saying that we need to analyze things first on the left as processes that are related to ecosystems, how they are affected by climate change or interact with climate change and human society, this kind of circle or triangle, or however you want to put it. And if you want to move from this idea that society and the biosphere are crucial and both affected and interacting with climate change, if you want to come to some action, then you end up with something that contains the same elements, and that has become then labeled as climate resilient development. Climate resilient development for human health, for well-being, for equity, for justice. Other terms, like you have in the name of this meeting, ecosystem health or planetary health. So health is a concept that helps us. And I just want to show a few terms from the IPCC press release after the sixth assessment on this matter. What is then climate resilient development? So it means that we need to reduce climate risks, of course, and by adaptation. We also need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by mitigation. We need to enhance, not only conserve, but enhance biodiversity. And ultimately, we will have to make progress, significant progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And how do we do that? We do not do this by applying one simple solution, by downloading some kind of, or by producing some technology and then hoping that all the rest of these complex problems go away. We need to have a solutions framework that is considered across government and all of civil society, something where we are really not making a lot of progress at the moment. We need to involve everyone, partnerships, of course. We need to use a lot of different knowledge, and that is something that I think even in the scientific community, and hopefully your community, you will have to consider perhaps better than my generation has done, how can we use other knowledge than that is taught at a technical or scientific university. There's a lot of knowledge out there that's not typically making it into our solutions frameworks, and we are now realizing that indigenous knowledge, for example, local knowledge, practical knowledge, how to build something is becoming an equally important part of the climate resilient development. And of course, as I mentioned, ecosystems that need to be either conserved or even restored are a significant part of this. And the issues of equity and justice are not just marginal to this. Without a proper consideration of them, without a proper questioning of who provides natural resources for whom across the planet, for example, you're not going to achieve climate resilient development. So this is also a diagram that has shown, that Valerie has shown, and I want to insist on the fact that there are these options. We are still having options. The corridor is narrowing, but we have options. But all options have these consequences that there can be unstable points, and we can actually be on a positive track and then lose track of it if we do not actually follow this in a sustainable way as far as our policy measures and policy objectives are concerned. So this is climate resilient development, and of course, to get there, since we do not have anything that looks even remotely like climate resilient development at the moment, we need to argue for transformation. Again, IPCC and IPBES are helping us. In the 1.5 degrees report, for example, a few years ago, the IPCC itself was asking for far-reaching transitions in all systems, energy, land, urban infrastructure, including transport and buildings and industrial systems. And I want to take this opportunity to remind you that this kind of wording is wording that has been approved by representatives of all governments of the planet. This is not just some very motivated IPCC scientists who sat in a room and wrote this up, but it was actually discussed and debated, and the person who suffered most, I think, doing that process is Valérie, because she was chairing that process. But it was in the end approved, which none of us was really quite sure what happened. So this is, I'm not talking to you about some kind of green ecolo agenda that is not widely acceptable or something. The current president of this country and his representatives at that conference have enthusiastically approved this language. So we are now in a position to ask our leaders in all countries, now where are these transitions? How are you going to embark on them? And just for completeness, IPBES has made similar statements in its global assessment. They call it transformative changes. They're actually going to do a special report now on transformation. So transformation is obviously clearly what we need. And again, has been shown at the moment, transformation is what would bring us to this green corridor on this diagram from the GAP report. What we are not even remotely on track. What we do instead is these things. We should really ask ourselves, is mass tourism in the Mediterranean or elsewhere is going to help us with the transition? Do we even have a educated and serious and honest discussion about it? Or is this part of it going to bring us the transformation that we need? I do not think so. Some argue, like Greenpeace in this case, that a lot of this is actually greenwashing, and that there are ways to demonstrate that publicly. That may also not be a serious and well-measured discussion, but we need to have that discussion, and we are not currently having it. That's one of my main points today, that if we want to be serious about what our science policy interfaces have told us about the need for transformation, we need to have a serious discussion about how to actually orchestrate that transformation. Another aspect of not having a discussion of transformation is to say to those who demonstrate for the need to change the way we use water in our agricultural landscapes, to not declare them eco-terrorists, but to actually invite them to have a serious discussion about water use in agriculture. We could have that, and there are many scientists who would be ready to participate in that. And I'm not showing a picture from the A69, but building highways for cars across the landscape, across agricultural landscapes, is also not going to help us regarding the transformation. Before I end, I'm already too long, sorry, but I want to once again make the point for social science research, because in social sciences there's actually much more thinking and reflection and work and quantitative work about transformation than many of us physical and biological scientists are aware of. This is a study that's already now some years ago from Friederike Otto and others, but it's a large community behind this work who are asking very quantitatively, what does it actually take to install a transformation in a society? Which sectors of society? Is it the teaching system, the financial markets, the norms and values that we all in one hand share, but also that evolve? Is it our energy production? Is it what is it in society that we can actually change? In the policy dialogue, there's sometimes this idea, oh, well, there's all these bad industries, or there's these bad politicians, or these bad students, or there's a lot of pointing fingers at each other, but not enough discussion on what is it can we actually change. And I invite you all to read this paper by Ilona Otto to see what is the state of knowledge. And it is a scientific paper, just to remind you of that. Just because it's not physics or biology doesn't mean that it isn't science. And I think there's a lot of gains to make in our scientific effort on working towards the transformation by building new bridges across the natural sciences and the social sciences. basically, this is where I want to end. I mean, I could go on because it's my work for the coming years. I hope to start a new program on this transformational science, and there's a lot of interest, and I hope that many partners in France will join this. But this is the motto that I try to take along for that work, and that I hope you would join me. As you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. And I thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very impressive. Thank you very much. And now it's time for questions. Maybe do you have questions? You? Okay. Okay.
Thank you. It's very interesting. And you have mentioned one important thing about the migration, climate migration. Do you work with international organization for migration? And if so, in which ways?
I'm not sure. With international organizations for what?
For migration.
For population?
Migration.
Migration.
Migration, please, yeah.
No, not me personally, but the point on migration is, I think, more and more widely shared in the community. And what I am doing at the moment, or what I'm involved in, is the preparation of a special report by the Mediterranean experts on environmental climate change on migration and conflict. And because there was a very influential paper for a couple of years ago, which was in part overdoing things and in part misrepresented in the following discussion, because it seemed to show that the drought in Syria, basically in the 1990s, had sort of triggered social unrest and therefore migration, and therefore it was all a consequence of climate change. You see, I'm caricaturing a little bit, but there has been a huge debate about this, and I was among the people who initially were very convinced of this, because we thought there was clearly a mechanism: anthropogenic warming, drought, decrease in agricultural yields, and so on. But human society doesn't work in that way. And human society does include criminals such as the Syrian government, who are basically not even in an interest to protect the population. So if there were refugees, and most of them, of course, inside Syria, and then a very large number just coming to Lebanon, and very few coming to Europe, if there were these refugees, to attribute them in some kind of naive way to climate change was clearly wrong, was clearly missing the main point of the causes of the humanitarian crisis that is still going on. That's like one, and I think it is more widely accepted now. It doesn't mean that the original paper was wrong, but it created like a false impression that there was a direct link from warming to climate change to drought, migration. Voila, you have it. And it's much more complex than that, unfortunately, which doesn't mean that people are not suffering from climate change. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. Another question?
Hi again. Thank you very much for this presentation. I have a lot of questions, but I'm gonna ask one. I was wondering how can you today raise awareness about such a topic like habitability, when all the medias and all the people are looking for, like, everybody's looking about like the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, and nobody really cares about all the problems that you've just talked about. So how can we raise awareness about this?
Yeah, it's a question I ask myself every day, and I think we all ask ourselves every day. I do not think that there is unwillingness to recognize this. And by the way, I think many of the conflicts that we see in the world, including Ukraine and Gaza, are not unrelated. but as I've also just said, they're not consequences of it. So I think generally people who have access to the media, they cannot be completely unaware of this. The question is, do we see a public discourse and what I call a serious discussion in society about what to do about this? And I think we do not, and I think there are strong forces in our society that we all let play their game that make us think that other matters are even more important. And again, I think I would expect more from our leaders, from our governments, basically, or from all thought leaders, including belief leaders, including industrial leaders, to engage in a serious discussion on how to avoid this, the habitability crisis that I was pointing at. But the fact that you've invited Valerie and me to come here, I think is a good sign. And I think many of us and our colleagues, we are speaking on many occasions on this. So it can't be that we do not have a public interest on this.
Okay, I'm going to ask a second question. So when you talked about the biodiversity loss, I was wondering, do you think that the protected areas is a good solution? Because you also talked about the whole social thing, and we know that when we set protected areas, we kick out indigenous people, basically, and they are the ones who take the most care of biodiversity. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, the big difference perhaps between the climate problem and the biodiversity crisis is that the biodiversity has more local conditions that are special in some way. So there's no, I mean, of course, there are also special climate processes in certain regions, but in general, your question can only be answered properly case by case. But what we do see is that, first of all, a lot of the protected areas that we do have are not actually maintained properly and are therefore inefficient. This is mostly for the marine protected areas. We also know for terrestrial protected areas that their effectiveness to conserve species, particularly in the changing climate, would be greatly enhanced if there was more connectivity between them. There's a lot of ecological literature about that, but we see not so much happening in the real landscape because it's also difficult to manage. And you already hinted at it, that many landscapes, if they are used properly by people who are interested in maintaining them, you may not perhaps have exactly the same ecosystem as you would have in a natural case, but you have diversity and you have a functional ecosystem. And again, you only need to look at the Mediterranean, at the hills around the Mediterranean, then you see that there have been conditions where these landscapes have perhaps delivered more, had more biodiversity and have delivered more stability. I don't want to be romantic about it. There were also times when they're completely deforested. So there is a possibility, but it depends very much on a case-by-case assessment, yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Another questions?
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very nice. You mentioned during your presentation the case of some cities in Middle East and North Africa with a huge increase, the threat of heat waves. Those city models project that there will be probably millions, tens of millions of inhabitants in the future. Do you think it's really possible to mitigate the effect of those heat waves rather than just adapt, as it seems that what they do at the moment?
Well, I think you can do something, and that's also a general message across all sectors, that doing something is better than doing nothing. And I live part of my life still in a Mediterranean city, which is called Marseille. And in Marseille, you see that there's some willingness to make it more resilient to climate change, and there's a lot of talk, but there's essentially way too little action compared to what a city like Marseille could do. Basically getting cars and diesel engines out of the city and making it a walkable and bicycling city, like, again, I'm caricaturing a little bit, but like Paris is clearly capable of doing it to a certain degree. Why couldn't a city like Marseille do that, or Athens, or Alexandria, or Tunis? So there's unless we have done a serious effort, we shouldn't give up. But it's also clear that these trends that I've shown there, and that goes for many sectors, both for heat waves and for sea level rise and for droughts and even for the extreme events, if we don't get serious about mitigating the greenhouse gas emissions, then it will be very hard to actually manage the adaptation in this. And this is for the cities and for coastal systems and for most systems the same principle. But we can do a lot more. And again, I think in the French sector of the Mediterranean, there even are so many financial resources. You cannot even say that, oh no, we don't have the money. I mean, the money is there. We would just need to spend it on that rather than, for example, building larger airports or larger cruise ship terminals.
Okay, we have the time for the last questions. No? Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. Where do you position degrowth, which is which public discourses are very reluctant to talk about and implement?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity, and it's a frequently coming question. The use of the term degrowth is in itself meant to be a little bit of a provocation by those who use it. They do not, those experts, expert economists that I regularly meet and that are in front of the degrowth movement, like Timothy Parikh and Georgios Kallis and others, they do not claim that the quality of our life with regard to, for example, healthcare or food or something like that should shrink. That's not what they mean. What they question is the belief that is really just like it's not even an ideology. It's a belief that the increase in one indicator, one economic indicator that was invented temporarily at the end of the world economic crisis in the 1920s, the GDP. That the growth in this indicator would actually help us achieve better life for everyone on Earth. And I mean, it's like, it's a ridiculous idea from the onset, but it's just continued to be preached to us as a belief. For example, if you listen to it every morning between 7 and 9 by somebody called Dominique Seux on France Inter, it's basically a belief story that we are given every morning and we are supposed to swallow it. Serious economists do not believe in that kind of growth as an increase in well-being on the planet anymore. And the real question is, how do we transfer our economic system into one that is more powerful in delivering what we all want, which is basically habitability or decent living conditions. And to use degrowth as a name, as a catchword for saying that, again, that's a provocation, but it's not really a good description of what it is that we actually want. We want equity. And all of us, not just me, but it's just the general idea. And we need an economic system and also an economic science that better identifies trajectories towards equity and the fulfilling of basic life conditions. And that we call it degrowth is perhaps a little bit unfortunate.
But at some point, somebody is going to have to stand up and admit to the young people, to the parents, to their children, that they cannot live the way that we did, that maybe they cannot own their own house, that they cannot own a car, that they have to live in communal accommodation, that They cannot go on vacation to Thailand. And, you know, when is a politician, how is it ever going to happen that a politician is going to stand up and admit that that's where we have to go?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there is also an answer to it because, of course, in a democracy, you cannot expect an elected politician to be completely at odds with what the mainstream in society is. I mean, that's the whole idea of democracy, that we don't have that. But what we can have, and we have very successful examples of that, we can have consultation. We can have situations where we sit together in, I would say, comfortable conditions with access to good information, and where we debate, outside party loyalties, outside perhaps loyalties to some employer or something like that. And the most famous example that everyone knows in France was the Convention Citoyenne for the Climat, where basically time and information was given to debate what we seriously want and how we want to cope with this crisis. And there's no reason, I think, to not have more efforts like that, either for local or regional questions, not just for the climate, but for basic societal issues. And there are also examples from elsewhere in the world where you can see that there's serious progress that can be made in that way. So I'm a big fan of that kind of effort. I would just prefer that the government leaders who launch that effort, if they promise to apply the outcome sans filtre, as it was the case here in France, and that they would actually keep that promise. That would greatly enhance the validity and the success of this kind of process, and this was unfortunately not given.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang, and thank you as well